Welcome to Demon Sleep. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. If you enjoy this space, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It makes this feel like a shared night across the world. These stories are different and I'm glad you're here. Dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's begin. Story 1, The Thing Behind Her Eyes. What would you do if a dead man asked you to come back to the place that broke you, just to claim what he left behind? The letter didn't waste ink on sympathy. No condolences, no memories, just a date, an address, and the quiet certainty of obligation. October 15th, Bellwether House. Be there or lose everything. I hadn't said that name out loud in decades. Bellwether. Even thinking it felt like pressing on an old bruise just to check if it still hurt. I told myself it was just a building. Wood, stone, empty rooms. But my hands tightened on the steering wheel as the car rolled away from the station and into the trees. The road twisted like it was unsure whether it wanted visitors. The forest on either side felt undecided too, trimmed in places, feral in others, as if someone had started controlling it once, then given up. When the house finally appeared, it wasn't with grandeur. It crept into view, smaller than my memories but heavier, like it had learned how to compress itself over the years. Something about it didn't sit right. The front stretched wide, but the windows were thin, almost stingy with light. Chimneys crowded the roof as if the house needed more mouths than it had rooms. It looked overbuilt, like it was hiding something inside its walls. The door opened before I knocked. That was the first real shock. Not a servant, not a caretaker, him. The solicitor who'd stood beside my father for most of my life. He held a folder under one arm and wore the expression of a man doing a job he begged not to be assigned. He explained, calmly, politely, that the staff were gone, fired on instruction. The house was to sit empty except for us, only during probate. Only long enough to matter. Inside, the air felt held, like the rooms were waiting to exhale. They were already there. My brother leaned against the fireplace, pretending ease. His suit was sharp in a way that screamed new money, new choices, new desperation to look unbothered. Across the room, our cousin sat upright, clutching his briefcase like it could shield him from whatever came next. No hugs, no smiles, just last names traded like paperwork. The solicitor delayed, cleaned his glasses, folded the letter, unfolded it again. A man buying time because time was the only mercy left. Then he read. The inheritance would be split evenly. Fair, clean, simple. But only if each of us spent a night alone in the house. Not together, not supervised. One night alone within the month. Fail and your share vanished. The silence after that wasn't empty. It pressed in. My brother laughed first, too loud, too fast, like laughter could puncture the idea before it settled. Our cousin protested, voice thin, citing rules and legality and reason. The solicitor didn't flinch. The clause stood, ironclad, argued over, lost. We drew lots. Wooden sticks clenched in his fist, fate reduced to splinters. I pulled the shortest one. And just like that, the house had chosen me first. Holmesworth walked her as far as the corridor, then stopped. He said the east wing was ready for her. His voice softened at the end, his eyes doing that careful thing people do when they think they're being kind. He advised her, quietly, to stay where she was assigned. He'd be back at 11 in the morning. She was to call him then. Confirm the night was done. When his car vanished down the drive, the house closed in. Old houses don't go silent, they swallow sound. The air thickened, padded, like every word would be overheard and remembered. Footsteps felt rude, breathing felt loud. Her brother grabbed his coat. tossed out a joke about waking their father's ghost. Their cousin muttered that their father hadn't believed in ghosts. She watched them leave and spoke to the hollow space they abandoned. He believed in consequences. The east wing ended in a room that had once been called a nursery, though it never truly was. No children had grown here. No toys had been loved into ruin. This side of the house was a display case, rooms frozen for purposes that never arrived. The door fought her, then gave up with a sharp complaint. The smell hit first. Not rot, not mold, something worse. Air that had been sealed on purpose, stale by design. Dolls filled the room. Dozens of them, arranged neatly on wooden benches, circling a tiny table. Porcelain faces, folded hands, teacups frozen mid-gesture, dresses clashing across centuries, stitched from different eras, all pretending to belong together. They watched without eyes moving, without blinking, with the patience of objects that had waited a very long time. One sat apart. A smaller chair by the window, a rocking chair. Its dress was newer, 70s maybe. The face was painted too carefully, especially the eyes. She didn't touch it. She pulled the cloth from the little bed, lay down fully dressed, coat pulled tight like armor. She told herself sleep wouldn't come. But travel has its own cruelty. When she woke, the light was wrong, thinner, slanted. And the doll was no longer in the rocking chair. It now sat with the others. Have you ever stared at something and felt it staring back, with recognition? I told myself I was wrong. Memory lies. Light lies. Old rooms stretch and shrink when they want to. The doll sat third from the left now, and maybe it had always been there. Maybe I was inventing movement to excuse the unease crawling up my spine. Still, I stepped closer. Its face tugged at something buried. Not familiarity exactly, worse than that. A resemblance without a source. The eyes sat just a little too close. The mouth curved in a way I'd rehearsed in my mind for years without meaning to. I had imagined my daughter's face through every age she never shared with me. Toddler, teenager, woman. This porcelain thing carried echoes of all of them, stitched together wrong. I backed away to the bed. Sleep was no longer a promise, just a theory. The dolls watched as daylight drained from the room, their glass eyes hoarding the last scraps of it. Time thickened. The house began its quiet work, wood shifting, walls breathing, the subtle clicks and sighs of something old settling into itself. Or walking. I fixed my gaze on the ceiling, tracing cracks like constellations, pretending not to hear the soft rhythm that could have been pipes or feet. When I looked again, the doll was on the floor beside me. My hand shook as I lifted it. The cold was expected, the texture was not. The surface felt tired, used. Up close, I saw the fractures, fine lines spidering from the eyes, frozen tears baked into glaze. The dress wasn't costume fabric. It was worn, stained, repaired by someone who hadn't wanted to throw it away. I asked it a question, just one, the kind you whisper when you already know there won't be an answer. I set it on the table and lay back down. Sleep came in shards, nurseries without walls, children with blended faces, mine, my mother's, strangers. I woke again and again. The third time, it was breathing distance away. I screamed and shoved, rolling off the bed as it fell with me. The sound it made when it hit the floor wasn't ceramic. It was wet, final. The head split. A dark substance oozed out, too thick for blood, too glossy for ink. The smell hit my mouth like a coin held too long between the teeth. Lead, old paint, poison from another era. The room tilted, edges blurred, the taste intensified. The dolls leaned forward. Not much, just enough. Not to watch, but to assess. I dragged myself upright, gripping the bed frame as my legs argued with gravity. The metal tang flooded my senses, heavy and inescapable. And the house felt very pleased with itself. What if the moment of understanding is what finally kills you? The room began to spin, slow and deliberate, like the world had decided to loosen one screw at a time. Somewhere behind her eyes, balance gave up. The broken doll still faced her. Even split open, even ruined, it held that unbearable resemblance. And now, in the thin blue light before sunrise, she saw it clearly. Not a generic child, not a guess, a construction. That face had been assembled piece by piece. Her own childhood photographs, her mother's cheekbones, the curve of a mouth borrowed from a man whose name she had buried decades ago, the face she had built in her mind for the daughter she never held long enough to know, the daughter she could only imagine forward through time. This wasn't coincidence. This was design. The truth landed with the sharpness that comes just before the body gives out. Her father had known. Of course he had. He'd always known. The kind of man who collected secrets the way others collected wealth. Nothing that happened in this house escaped him. He hadn't stumbled into this. He had planned it, ordered the doll, shaped it, painted it, set it in this room like a trap that waited patiently for years. He hadn't needed violence. He'd chosen chemistry. Toxic paint, sealed air, a bed placed just close enough, a night long enough to breathe the past into her blood. She tried to stand. Her legs folded without discussion. The metallic taste flooded her mouth, stronger now, undeniable. The room tilted again, the dolls drifting in and out of focus as she fell. They didn't leer. They didn't smile. They watched. Not with cruelty, with the neutrality of witnesses. She understood then that this was the inheritance, not money, not property, knowledge you can't set down once it's lifted, punishment disguised as procedure. A man who understood that the most merciless gifts are the ones wrapped in legality. Her last clear thought came as she stared at the ruined doll's face, the face that mirrored the daughter she'd invented to survive the years. He wanted me to see it. He wanted recognition and poison to arrive together. He wanted guilt to have a shape. The room held its breath as she faded. Morning came anyway. She was found alive, curled beside the small bed, fingers stretched toward the broken doll like she'd almost reached something that mattered. Her breathing was shallow, stubborn. The house released her reluctantly. She survived. Doctors would later whisper about numbers that didn't make sense, lead levels that belonged to another century. They never found a source. She never told them about porcelain. For the rest of her life, she would flinch at smooth ceramic surfaces, cups, plates, dolls behind glass. The inheritance wasn't death. It was knowing. At 11 sharp, the solicitor arrived to flashing lights and sirens. Her brother stood off to the side, arms folded, watching with an expression that refused easy translation. The cousin hadn't come back. Work, the solicitor said. Always work. She stayed in the hospital 3 days. The solicitor visited once, papers in hand, signatures required. His voice stayed careful. He did not mention the house. He did not mention the doll. And she understood something else then. Silence, too, can be inherited. The solicitor never mentioned the dolls, but when she signed, his eyes dropped to her hands. The pen rattled softly against the paper, just enough to be noticed. The doctors later gave it a name, Long-term exposure, old pigments accumulated over hours that shouldn't have mattered. They told her she was fortunate, found in time, as if luck had anything to do with intention. Her brother went next. A week later, the house welcomed him with a different face. The West Wing, rooms once reserved for important guests, people whose names had faded but whose presence had lingered long after they'd stopped arriving. According to the records, that wing hadn't been empty nearly as often as it claimed. He called right on time the next morning, 11 sharp. His voice was controlled, stripped of its usual polish. He said the night was done, said the paperwork could proceed. When asked how it had gone, he paused, just briefly, then said a family question had been answered. Nothing worth explaining, nothing that needed repeating. The last draw fell to their cousin. He would later insist the sticks had all looked identical. Fate likes to hide in symmetry. The north wing was assigned to him, the study, the room their father had chosen to shrink into for the final 10 years of his life. Holmesworth was precise this time. Nothing moved, nothing touched. The room was to remain exactly as it had been left. The sympathy in his eyes returned. Timothy didn't notice, or pretended not to. He accepted the key with confidence, reassured the solicitor with the language of reason. He would work, he would sleep, he would leave. Houses were structures, not stories. Fear was for people who wanted it. The solicitor said only one thing before driving away. Stay where you're assigned. The third night began. Julian did not expect company. He was midway through cataloging the furnishings, running mental numbers, imagining resale values, when someone stood in the doorway of the main bedroom. He hadn't heard footsteps. He hadn't heard the door open. The woman wore a dress from another century. High collar, tight sleeves, fabric that caught the low light in a way modern cloth never quite manages. Not costume, not imitation, something preserved. She watched him like he'd interrupted her. Julian spoke first. A joke, a reflex, it landed nowhere. She stepped into the room. And with that single step, the house reminded him, quietly, efficiently, that some inheritances don't wait their turn. The fabric caught the lamplight in a way that didn't behave like cloth. It shimmered, almost fluid, as if the light were sinking into it instead of bouncing away. And when she stepped fully into the room, slow, intentional, the sound followed. That soft, intimate hush of silk brushing against layers beneath it. Starch whispering where starch should have long since turned to dust. The smell reached him next. Lavender, yes, but spoiled. Sweetness turned tired. Beneath it, something warmer, damp. The scent of old pipes after hot water has sat too long. Copper steam. A bathroom door closed too late. Her face resisted categorization. Not young, not old, preserved. The kind of agelessness money and discipline used to buy, back when time was something you could negotiate with. Bone structure doing most of the work now. I was hoping you might help me, she said. Her voice was educated, shaped by lessons and mirrors. Every vowel placed carefully, but under it something else. A regional edge sanded down through years of correction. The tone was polite, almost pleasant, yet strained at the edges, like a container holding more than it was designed for. Julian's instincts clicked in. Assess. Measure, is this a risk or a resource? She looked solid enough. Too solid, perhaps. And yet the lamplight never quite settled on her. It slid. Ripples where there shouldn't be movement. Even standing still, she seemed in transit. He chose concern, the practiced version, the one that reassured nervous widows and opened doors to sensitive conversations. She told him she had lost her son. Not recently, she added. Time had blurred. The loss existed somewhere outside of dates. She had been looking for him throughout the house, searching room by room. He was 7 or maybe 8. He had been playing in the bath. She had stepped away for only a moment, just a moment. Her hands made a small, incomplete motion in the air, as if finishing the memory required an object that was no longer there. Julian asked the obvious question, the name. Frederick, she said softly, then almost fondly, little Freddie. From the folds of her dress she produced a photograph, small, framed in metal dulled by time and touch. She held it out to him. A boy stared back from the image, dressed in a sailor's outfit, spine straight, expression solemn in that way children once were when they sat for portraits, like they already understood how short the arrangement was. Julian noticed something odd. Her fingers didn't fog the glass. At first he saw nothing familiar. Then the details began to align. Subtle things. The distance between the eyes, the firmness of the jawline, the angle at which the ears joined the skull, just slightly more pronounced than average. His throat tightened. Those were his features. Not identical, but undeniable. The realization didn't arrive as panic. It arrived as arithmetic. And somewhere deep in the house, water began to run. Family resemblance, he told himself. That was all. Blood leaving fingerprints across generations. Still, he'd never seen that photograph before. Not in the albums his mother guarded like scripture. Not once. I'll help you, he said, surprising himself with how quickly the words came. The house is big, but we can be thorough. Children hide. They fall asleep in places no one thinks to look. Her gratitude landed too heavily, like a weight dropped into his chest. But grief often did that. Julian had seen it before, people clinging to offered help as if it were a life raft, squeezing until the rescuer felt unsteady. He followed her into the hallway. Her steps made no sound. The carpet runner lay flat beneath her feet, untouched. As he walked behind her, the scent thickened. Lavender gave way to something wetter, older. The smell of standing water trapped in porcelain for decades. The kind of dampness that never truly dries. They moved through the guest wing, room after room. Beds dressed and untouched. Mirrors dulled with age. A small library lined with novels no one had opened in generations. In every space, she paused and called the boy's name, her voice tightening each time. Frederick. Again. Frederick. Julian felt something stirring that he didn't like, an emotion that skipped past strategy and calculation. It bypassed profit and self-preservation and went straight for something primitive, protective, almost obedient. With each room, the air grew heavier, moist. He tasted minerals on his tongue. His skin prickled as if humidity were settling on him despite the house's cold bones. In the 4th bedroom, she stopped. A large wardrobe loomed against the wall. She turned to face him. The dress whispered long after her body had gone still, fabric continuing to move on its own, as though it hadn't yet received the instruction to stop. "Do you remember the bath?" she asked. The question didn't just reach his ears. It struck his body, like stepping into darkness and missing the stair. Yes. Not this bath, not this house, but a bath. Water closing over his head, the shock of it, the betrayal, lungs burning, and hands, strong hands, holding him under. He had always labeled them maternal, had wrapped the memory in something safer. "I don't understand," he said. But he did. She moved then, fast, too fast, the careful packing abandoned. Her hands reached for him, and they were no longer refined, no longer delicate. These hands remembered leverage, pressure, the mechanics of restraint. "The bathroom," she said, "just there. 2 doors down." And the house, patient as ever, opened its mouth to receive them. She said it like a reminder, not a direction, as if his body hadn't already decided for him. His feet moved, not fast, not slow, certain. Each step carried him closer to a knowledge he didn't want but could no longer refuse. The bathroom waited. The tub was old porcelain, deep and oval, made for an age when bathing was deliberate, almost ceremonial. It was full, water resting perfectly still, unbroken, reflective as glass. He hadn't run it. He knew that, or thought he did. Certainty had started to behave strangely. "I've been waiting," she said gently. Her voice held no accusation, only patience. 100 years might sound like a lifetime, she went on, but to her it had been no more than the space between breaths. Time, she explained, stretches differently when you're unfinished. She'd known him the moment he stepped inside the house. Faces change, names rot, but souls carry markings that never fade. She recognized her Freddie immediately, no matter what adulthood had pressed onto him. Julian tried to step back. The doorframe wasn't where it had been. The bathroom folded inward, shrinking until it felt like the only place that had ever existed. White porcelain, steaming air, her face shifting, motherly one moment, something ancient and resolved the next. "You were difficult," she said almost fondly. Willful, loud, always testing limits. She tried kindness, rules, pleas, hope. Hope had been the first thing to die. The bath, she explained, had been offered as a solution. They told her it was quick. Once the struggling stopped, it would be over, merciful. But he had fought. So she had learned. This time the water was perfect. Not hot enough to panic, not cold enough to shock. She had practiced the movements in her mind until they were smoother than memory. There would be no interruption, no one calling her away. Julian's last clear thought came as her hands guided him down. He had built his entire life on a lie about himself. Clever, untouchable, the man who always slipped through consequences. But this was who he had always been. The child in the tub. The one who still believed mothers could be reasoned with. That some invisible rule would step in. That someone, anyone, would stop it. The water closed over him, calm and prepared, as if it had been waiting just as long. Above the surface, the woman, called many names across the years, but knowing herself only as Freddie's mother, held him with hands strengthened by a century of waiting. And she hummed, a lullaby from a time before photographs, before second chances, when there had been only one stubborn child, and one mother who would not fail again. Time has a way of carrying decisions forward long after the hand that made them is dust. Some choices don't end. They just keep falling, like stones dropped into wells that were never meant to have a bottom. Timothy arrived exactly on schedule. 6 o'clock, not early, not late. Precision was comfort. Holmesworth's car pulled away almost immediately, tires crunching faster than necessary on the gravel, the same hurried withdrawal Timothy had noticed after the others. He filed that away without comment. The north wing greeted him with order. The study was untouched, preserved like an exhibit. Dark wood panels drank in the light. A desk so large it suggested authority rather than utility dominated the room. Bookcases wrapped the walls, a complete gentleman's library beginning mid-century and quietly accumulating years beyond that. as if knowledge itself had refused to stop aging. A wingback chair waited by the fireplace. A decanter rested on a side table, amber liquid catching the glow. Timothy ignored it. He trusted his own supplies. Mineral water, plain biscuits, tea prepared earlier, still warm in its thermos. Control, he believed, began with what you consumed. He sat, opened his laptop, and got to work. Inheritance was a process. Assets, liabilities, valuations. The Bellwether estate would submit to the same formulas as any other. Ghost stories, if that's what his cousins were nursing, had no place in ledgers. 3 hours passed cleanly. Emails answered. Reports completed. A client reassured. Numbers behaved the way numbers always had. At 9, he permitted himself a break. Tea, 2 biscuits. He stood at the window, looking out over the north garden, trimmed into submission long ago and maintained by habit rather than affection. Back at the desk, something new registered. The bottom drawer. It hadn't been locked. Inside lay a stack of notebooks, identical in size and binding. Leather, well kept. Dates stamped neatly in gold along their spines. 30 years' worth. His uncle's journals. Timothy believed in privacy abstractly. In practice, family estates complicated philosophy. He opened the most recent volume. The handwriting was unmistakable, familiar from cards, from letters written with deliberate formality. The entries were dated, structured, clinical. This wasn't reflection. It was record-keeping, observation. Like research. The first pages cataloged family members. Measured, assessed. Varity persists in selective forgetting regarding the events of 1978. She mistakes distance for forgiveness. I have arranged a corrective experience. Timothy's mouth went dry. He turned the page. Julian continues to demonstrate the same moral elasticity he displayed as a child. He mistakes survival instincts for virtue. Exposure may clarify the distinction. Each sentence landed with quiet finality. Not anger, not cruelty. Intent. Timothy understood then with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with fear, that this house had not been waiting passively. It had been prepared. Each room, each night, each person. The inheritance was never money. It was completion. And somewhere in the house, wood shifted softly, like a book being closed after the final chapter. Venture capitalists and paper-thin developments that exist only in glossy brochures. His greatest skill is not deception of others, but deception of himself. Instruction has been arranged. The words didn't accuse, they diagnosed. Page after page followed the same pattern. A lifetime reduced to observations. Minor failures pinned and labeled. Disappointments logged with the care of a scientist cataloging insects. Then Timothy appeared. At first sporadically. Timothy visited today to satisfy his quarterly obligation. His questions about my health were interrupted by repeated glances at his watch. He was calculating, accurately, the remaining span of my life against his long-term financial models. He smiled. I reciprocated. Timothy swallowed. The entries multiplied. He speaks frequently of duty. What he performs is theater. He does not recognize the difference. Another page. Today he asked again about the estate, not from concern for my wishes, but from the actuarial curiosity of those who wait for death as a milestone. Timothy turned pages faster now, too fast, searching for mercy, for error, for a moment where this cold portrait cracked. It never did. Instead, the journals recorded every visit, every practiced expression, every carefully weighted gesture meant to suggest warmth without requiring it. Obligation in a tailored suit, passing for love. The handwriting changed near the end, still neat, still controlled, but no longer observational. Now it planned. For Varity, the nursery, let her encounter the face she constructed in absence. Memory must become tangible. For Julian, the West Wing, Mrs. Wentworth has been patient. Some accounts persist beyond death. Timothy's breath grew shallow. Then his name appeared alone at the top of the page. For Timothy, his hands did not shake, not yet. The final entry was written with the same calm precision, even knowing it must have been composed days, perhaps hours, before death. For my faithful grandson, who never visited out of affection but only obligation, who smiled while counting the days remaining to me, I leave my most refined gift. Timothy read on. He will understand that I saw him clearly. I leave him everything, and with it doubt. Not curses, not apparitions. Uncertainty. He will spend his life questioning which object I touched last. Which book, which chair, which room carries intention. He will dismantle his own happiness searching for what I may have prepared, or what I may not have prepared at all. Timothy felt something tighten in his chest. The uncertainty will do what punishment cannot. It will rot him slowly. He will never know if the trap exists, only that it could. The final line waited at the bottom of the page, perfectly aligned. Perhaps the knowledge itself is sufficient. The study was silent. Too silent. Timothy closed the journal with deliberate care and placed it back in the drawer. His reflection stared at him from the polished wood of the desk, pale, alert, listening. For the first time since entering the house, he understood. The others had been given nights. He had been given a lifetime. And as he reached for his bag, every object in the room seemed to lean subtly inward, inviting inspection, daring him to choose wrong. He understood now. The gift had always been his. The inheritance was his. Every penny, every estate, every meticulously curated object. But certainty, that would never arrive. Timothy closed the journal. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the treetops like 1,000 turning pages. The house sighed, settling into its age-worn bones, murmuring in ways only it could. Logic offered him a path: finish the probate, sell the estate, auction the objects, convert it all to numbers, to liquid, to modern investments too sterile to hold superstition. Safe, predictable, curses neutralized. But the journal sat on the desk, between his hands, heavy, demanding, and he could not look away. Which objects had his uncle touched? All of them, probably. 40 years of contact. But with what intention? That question replicated in his mind, multiplying like cells, filling every corner with doubt, scenarios, contingencies, impossibilities. He could walk away, refuse the inheritance entirely, let Varity and Julian divide it. But Varity was in the hospital, her mind frayed by lead. Julian, drowned in a bathtub no one could explain, circumstances that the police hesitated to classify as murder. The estate defaulted to him, all of it, every object, every room, every legacy, if he could withstand the weight of uncertainty. Timothy rose, moved to the bookshelf. He plucked a first edition Dickens worth perhaps 2,000. He examined it page by page, corner by corner, searching for what? Signs, tampering, curse. The book was exactly what it appeared: old, valuable, innocent. He replaced it, chose another, and another. Hours passed, objects waited. They might be innocuous, they might not. His uncle had understood Timothy completely, methodical, calculating, incapable of leaving a thing unexamined. Timothy would catalog, research, cross-reference, check provenance, analyze, inspect, hypothesize. He would spend months, perhaps years, in relentless vigilance. And in that endless scrutiny, in that inability to trust any corner of his inheritance, he would live the curse. Perfect, complete, invisible, yet inescapable. Returning to the desk, he opened his laptop. The screen lit his face. A new spreadsheet began. Each column, each row, a step deeper into obsession, certainty abandoned in favor of endless question. The night stretched on and the house listened. Have you ever wondered what it's like to inherit a house that doesn't just hold possessions, but memories sharp enough to cut? Timothy Marchmont did. And the moment the Bellwether estate fell into his hands, he realized it wasn't gold or silver or even dusty antiques that carried weight. It was knowledge, observation, doubt. He sat alone in the study, the lamplight slicing across his face, illuminating a stare so fixed it might have been carved in stone. Column headers scrolled across his screen. Item, location, estimated value, historical context, risk assessment. Every object cataloged, every detail cross-referenced, every inch of the estate dissected like a specimen under a microscope. Years, decades even, would pass before certainty could be claimed, and even then, it might remain just out of reach. Outside, the world slept. Dawn refused to break. Inside, Timothy typed like a man possessed, or perhaps like a man who had been possessed by purpose long before he realized it. The wealth surrounding him was staggering, yet beneath the numbers and assets lay a poverty only the mind could know. A hunger for truth, a gnawing suspicion that every polished surface, every heirloom might carry more than value, it might carry intent. And he was right. Bellwether House didn't just stand. It watched. It remembered. Every creak, every shadow, every object meticulously arranged over decades whispered of control, of manipulation, of inheritance delivered not in currency but in certainty and doubt. 6 months later, Timothy made the call, his voice precise, careful, almost rehearsed. "I've inherited a property," he said. "I require investigation of an unusual sort." On the other end was Dr. Catherine Kelway, not a physician, not a historian, but a scholar of minds and things that lingered beyond explanation. Her expertise was in parapsychology, a discipline her peers tolerated with polite skepticism, but one that Bellwether House demanded. Some houses absorb only dust. Others absorb intention, memory, obsession. Bellwether House had swallowed it all. From the entrance, Timothy guided her with the meticulous precision of a man who had trained himself to notice patterns others dismissed. Objects shifted overnight. Sounds emerged with unnerving regularity. Cold pockets appeared and vanished, defying logic. He had rehearsed these observations countless times, testing their rationality against his own disbelief. And the collections, each room told its own story. Assemblages arranged with the care of collectors who understood that every item was a note in a symphony of influence. A chair slightly out of line. A book open to a page that mattered. Every object a clue and perhaps a trap. Kelway stepped inside and felt it immediately. The attention of the house. The way it remembered, calculated, weighted. Buildings, like minds, could accumulate more than years. They could accumulate expectation, design, even vengeance. And this house had waited decades for the perfect inheritor. Timothy, typing, cataloging, nodding, had become that inheritor. Not because he wanted the fortune, but because he had been chosen to inherit its logic, its precision, its relentless, beautiful, terrifying curse. Every object would be examined, every shadow dissected, every anomaly measured, and in the process, Timothy would live the inheritance his uncle had left him. Not wealth, not comfort, but certainty shattered into meticulous, methodical doubt. Bellwether House didn't merely hold possessions. It held its master, even when that master believed he held it. And now it had found Timothy. By memory itself, every surface, every artifact, every meticulously arranged shelf carried intention. Not ghosts, but witness. Not vengeance in the spectral sense, but accountability made tangible. The house remembered what men forgot, and it never forgave. Dr. Kelway leaned back, her eyes tracing the contours of the Georgian table. Your uncle, she said softly, didn't just inherit wealth. He inherited life's debts, and he paid them forward, through objects, through space, through the very architecture of this home. Timothy sat rigid, the weight of comprehension pressing him into the chair. Every heirloom he had considered a treasure suddenly seemed loaded with judgment. The porcelain dolls, the leather-bound journals, the furniture polished to museum perfection. They were all instruments of observation. Reminders that actions echo far beyond the moment they are committed. The nursery, Kelway continued, was designed to confront. The doll there wasn't decoration. It wasn't even a keepsake. It was a mechanism, a way to make someone feel the consequences of choices long buried. Your uncle orchestrated it, knowing precisely who would encounter it and how. Timothy's fingers clenched on the edge of the table. He had believed inheritance was about property, numbers, control. He had been wrong. It was about perception, influence, the careful, invisible hand that shaped lives even decades later. And every object in this house, she said, carries a fragment of that intention, a puzzle piece of human behavior, grief, guilt, or revenge. They aren't haunted by spirits. They are haunted by consequence. And you, Timothy, have inherited both the estate and the responsibility to navigate it. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, sounding for the first time less like a house settling, and more like the echo of every decision, every secret, every unresolved debt embedded in the walls. Timothy understood at last. The Bellwether inheritance was never about money. It was about understanding, about seeing how meticulous observation could transform ordinary objects into vessels of reckoning. And as he looked around the drawing room at the teacups, the journals, the carved wood that had witnessed decades of human action, he realized that the true legacy of Bellwether House was not gold, not property. It was certainty born from doubt, justice disguised as preservation, and the inescapable weight of being seen. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to inherit not just wealth, but a trap? A legacy so precise, so deliberate, that every coin, every object, every perfectly polished shelf becomes a mirror reflecting your own doubts back at you. Timothy Marchmont learned this the hard way. When he first entered Bellwether House, he saw only a mansion, grand, meticulously curated, frozen in time. But the real inheritance wasn't in the walls or the furniture or the priceless books. It was in the intention. 40 years of careful, deliberate observation had been compressed into every object, every artifact, every shadow that moved just slightly in the corner of a room. He listened as Dr. Catherine Kelway, an expert in human perception and the subtle machinery of memory, explained the truth. There was no cursed doll, no single object carrying doom. Every item in the house was a vessel of intent, a silent witness to actions, decisions, and debts long past. The punishment wasn't dramatic, it was mental, invisible, and inescapable. The inability to separate coincidence from consequence, luck from retribution. Timothy felt it instantly. Each journal entry, each ledger, each photograph of furniture meticulously catalogued, became a needle pointing straight at him. His uncle had designed this inheritance like a clockmaker assembling gears, perfectly calibrated to make Timothy question everything he thought he knew about success, fortune, and trust. The house wasn't haunted by spirits, it was haunted by the mind, and by a master manipulator who had turned human psychology into the ultimate weapon. He could sell the estate, he could distribute the wealth, but nothing could unring the bell of awareness. Every possession now carried the invisible weight of scrutiny, judgment, and doubt. The dolls in the East Wing, the sideboards from generations past, even the volumes in the library, everything could be a trap, and yet nothing might be. That was the point. That was the cruelty of it. Dr. Kelway left him there with her warning and a quiet certainty that Timothy would understand soon enough. The true inheritance was not gold, nor property, nor prestige. It was perpetual uncertainty, a life lived under the unrelenting gaze of an invisible examiner who had long since passed away. Months later, she discovered a photograph tucked away in her files, a simple image of the drawing room's cabinet of curiosities. It captured every shelf, every porcelain figure, every miniature portrait with brutal clarity. She remembered how Timothy had watched her that first day, his gaze sharp, measured, almost expecting confirmation of the unease he hadn't yet fully acknowledged. The photograph didn't reveal a secret, but it revealed the method, the obsession, the meticulous design behind a legacy that was never about objects, but about consequences. And in that moment, she understood something terrifyingly simple. Bellwether House wasn't a home. It was a test. And Timothy Marchmont was already inside. Every step he took after that, every choice, every glance at an heirloom carried the echo of 40 years of deliberate design. The true curse wasn't supernatural. It was human. The inheritance didn't rob him of life. It robbed him of certainty. And in the end, that was worse than any ghost could ever be. He had inherited it all. Every possession, every fortune, and every single unanswerable question. Have you ever seen something so impossible that your mind refuses to accept it, even when the proof is staring back at you? Dr. Catherine Kelway did. She had spent decades chasing shadows through creaking old houses, cataloging the strange, the unexplained, the eerie footprints of human obsession. But nothing had prepared her for this. It started with a photograph, one she hadn't taken. Yet there it was, perfectly clear in her files. A porcelain figure, no more than 6 inches tall, standing at the heart of a cabinet she had documented 3 days earlier. The figure's stance was almost alive, one foot stepping forward, arms relaxed, posture impossibly natural for an object meant to be frozen in place. And the face stopped her cold. Miniature though it was, the features were unmistakable. The straight nose that traced back to her father, the sharp cheekbones that every camera had always caught, the exact angle where jaw met neck, all of it, rendered in flawless, cruel precision. It was her. She knew it without thinking, and that knowledge carried a weight that made her stomach tight. Hands trembling beneath her careful control, she made tea, the steam rising between her and the photograph like a curtain separating reason from reality. She returned to her desk, lifted the laptop, and stared. The figure hadn't moved. It had been there all along, nestled between a shepherdess in porcelain and a Georgian gentleman, as if the cabinet had always waited for her to notice. She called Bellwether House. The phone rang 3 times. Mr. Marchmont answered, his voice measured, polite, yet somehow taut with expectation. She asked if any new acquisitions had arrived. After a pause that seemed deliberately stretched to unsettle, he said no. Nothing had changed. The house, he claimed, remained exactly as she had left it. Professional courtesy demanded a follow-up. She suggested a second visit to verify the photograph and its impossibility. He agreed, too eagerly, too quickly. That eagerness told her more than words ever could. He wanted confirmation. He needed an answer she didn't yet have. They set a date for the coming week. In the days that followed, the photograph consumed her attention. 20 years of experience had taught her to approach the supernatural with methodical skepticism. Most hauntings, she knew, were tricks of perception. Shifting shadows, settling floorboards, the human brain's compulsion to see meaning in randomness. But this was different. This was deliberate, solid, real. Not the residue of suggestion, but the undeniable presence of intention. Every time she looked at it, her heart hammered a little faster. The figure didn't just occupy space, it asserted it. A challenge, a message, or a warning. She couldn't decide which. And the question that nagged her day and night was simple, yet unbearable. If this small object could exist outside of reality as she knew it, what else in that house was waiting for her to see? She packed her notes. She checked her equipment. And she prepared to return to Bellwether House, knowing that when she stepped through its doors again, she would be entering a world where observation was no longer passive, and every object might have its own story to tell, or its own secret to keep. Have you ever held a photograph that made your blood run cold? That was Dr. Kelway's Tuesday morning when she returned to Bellwether House. The air felt heavier somehow, thick with the weight of anticipation, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to watch. Mr. Marchmont met her at the door, precise as always, but something had shifted. His posture betrayed strain, his face paler, eyes sharper. The methodical focus she had admired before now teetered on obsession. He explained that he had been cataloging every room, photographing every object, tracing provenance like a detective chasing invisible threads. Months of work, barely begun. Dr. Kelway asked immediately about the cabinet of curiosities. He led her through the drawing room, and there it stood, unchanged in placement, but somehow charged with a new tension. She approached it slowly, pulse quickening against reason. The shelves held their usual contents. Seals and fobs above, tiny portraits in the center, porcelain figures below. 8 figures, 8 only. The 9th, her miniature self, the one from the impossible photograph, was gone. "Have you moved anything?" she asked, barely masking the tremor in her voice. "I haven't touched a thing," he said, voice flat, almost defensive. "I've only documented. Everything remains exactly as my uncle left it." She turned the laptop toward him. The photograph glared back, proof of the impossible. He examined it closely, then the shelf, then back to the screen. Finally, he asked the question that made her stomach drop. "Do you believe photographs can lie?" Not through trickery, he clarified, but by the subtle act of observation itself. By capturing a moment, perhaps you changed it. Dr. Kelway admitted uncertainty. In her world, observation altered reality, but never like this. Objects didn't vanish. They didn't migrate across shelves at whim. So they documented again. Every angle, every shadow, every glint of porcelain captured in meticulous detail. The afternoon crawled by in clicks and flashes, her camera a lens into something she could barely define, while Marchmont silently recorded notes in his leather journal, the echo of a legacy built on surveillance, control, and quiet dread. That evening, when they reviewed the photographs, reality fractured. 17 of the 23 images showed the 9th figure. Sometimes it stood at the center, sometimes at the edge of the 3rd shelf, as if walking among its companions. In one photograph, impossibly, it had shifted to the 2nd shelf entirely, standing amidst the miniature portraits, staring outward with that undeniable presence. The room was the same. The objects hadn't moved, and yet in the photographs the impossible was undeniable. The line between observation and manipulation blurred, and Dr. Kelway realized the truth. She wasn't documenting the cabinet. The cabinet was documenting her. Have you ever felt a presence so deliberate, so impossibly patient, that it seemed to breathe alongside you, waiting for the exact moment to reveal itself? That's how Dr. Kelway felt the instant she returned to Bellwether House for the night. Mr. Marchmont had prepared the guest room with meticulous care, his movements precise to the point of obsession. Tea placed just so, light adjusted to avoid glare on her instruments, questions asked with a practiced neutrality that somehow hinted at hope, hope that she would suggest exactly what he wanted. And she did. She asked to stay overnight. As twilight settled over the estate, shadows stretched long across the drawing room, pooling in corners like dark water. She asked about the uncle, the man who had amassed this strange and intricate collection. How had he obtained such objects? He dealt across the continent, Marchmont explained. Auctions, private collectors. Reputation mattered to him. Rare provenance, premium prices. But whether he understood the deeper threads, the connections between objects and people, debts and secrets, is harder to say. Dr. Kelway felt a chill run down her spine. Did intention matter at all? Could objects chart their own course, drawn to the places they were destined to occupy, silently gathering meaning over decades, regardless of human awareness? She let the question hang, unanswered, as Marchmont left for the village, promising to return only in daylight. Alone, she returned to the cabinet. The light from the lamp struck the glass at a low angle, casting reflections that danced across the floor. She pulled a chair close, camera ready, a silent witness to whatever was about to unfold. Hours passed in the soundscape of old wood settling, nails shifting, tiny percussive creaks echoing through empty corridors. She photographed the cabinet every 15 minutes, capturing a time lapse of nothing, or so it seemed. At 3 o'clock, the room shifted. Not the cabinet itself, but her perception. The corner between the bookshelf and the window rippled, as though the air itself carried intention. She turned slowly, careful not to startle whatever was there. A man stood in the shadow. His attire dated him to the 1950s. Jacket pressed, trousers sharply creased. His posture was rigid, the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention without speaking. The room seemed to contract around him. And then his face, she recognized the angles, the shadows, the subtle curve of a jaw, even in the dim lamplight. It was not exactly him, not living, yet impossibly familiar. As her breath caught in her throat, the house exhaled around her. A low sigh of wood and stone that felt like acknowledgement. Dr. Kelway raised her camera, shaking slightly, and clicked. The figure did not vanish. It merely shifted, imperceptibly, inching closer to the cabinet, as though drawn to the narrative already recorded there. Porcelain and memory, shadow and glass, all converging in a quiet demonstration of something neither entirely supernatural nor fully explainable. For the first time in decades of investigations, she understood. The house didn't need ghosts to haunt it. It needed witnesses. It needed her. And in that fragile, luminous moment, she realized that some presences are not bound by time. They are bound by attention, by scrutiny, by the unblinking insistence of a mind willing to observe without ever looking away. Hours more passed. The man remained, neither threatening nor benign, an immovable record of inheritance, of obsession, of history carved into living space. And when dawn finally seeped through the curtains, She knew that whatever had been captured here tonight would never leave her. Not as a photograph, not as memory, and certainly not as certainty. Some things, she thought, are never meant to be fully understood. They are only meant to be witnessed. What stood in the corner wasn't his nephew, but it wore him the way handwriting wears a family name. The structure of the face gave it away. The same bones, the same angles, just older, sharper, as if time itself had been distilled and poured into human shape. She understood instantly. This wasn't the man who had inherited the house. This was the will that had built it, or something that had learned to speak using his outline. It looked at her the way a collector looks at an object they've been searching for without realizing it. Not hunger, not anger, assessment. You believed you left, it said, and the sound felt borrowed, like an echo replaying a voice long gone. You crossed the doorway and convinced yourself the house was behind you. She swallowed, her heart hammered but her voice held. I did leave. I went back to my life. I took other cases. The smile it gave her was gentle, almost indulgent, the kind reserved for people who confuse movement with escape. It drifted closer to the cabinet. Drifted was the only word, no footsteps, no weight, just relocation. It gestured toward the shelves with pride. I preserve what others overlook, it said. Moments, debts, people who mattered less than they believed. Every piece here was chosen, not randomly, never randomly. Its attention settled on the porcelain figures. The doll was built from longing, it continued. The furniture from unpaid histories, the books from promises that aged without fulfillment. A pause. These, it said, indicating the figures, are more intimate. Cold bloomed in her chest, spreading outward like frost under skin. What do they hold? She asked. It turned back to her. Participants. The word landed heavier than a threat. Those who enter this house seeking explanation, it went on, eventually become part of what requires explaining. You observed carefully. You cataloged. You recorded with devotion. Your work will last longer than memory itself. It tilted its head, studying her. It seemed only fair that you be included. She pushed herself upright. Her legs protested, distant and unreliable. The door was there, 15 feet, a straight line. She measured it instinctively, speed, timing, breath. Then she understood how pointless that math was. If this thing wasn't a ghost, but a pattern, if it existed through intention, through objects, through the house as a single extended body, then space meant nothing. You're offering me a choice, she said quietly. Understanding settled in with a clarity that hurt. The figure regarded her kindly. I'm offering truth. The cabinet glass reflected them both, one living, one curated. You can leave, it said, and carry this knowledge forward. Spend the rest of your life circling it, teaching it, warning others while pretending you were never touched. Its hand lifted, indicating the empty space on the shelf. Or you can remain, become precise, permanent, a record no one can dismiss. Her breath shook. What happens if I refuse? The house answered first. Wood creaking, walls sighing, objects humming softly with shared memory. The figure smiled. Refusal, it said, is simply another way of staying. The light flickered, and somewhere in the cabinet, porcelain shifted, making room. The choice had already been made the moment she returned. The photograph had been the hinge, the invitation she didn't know she accepted. When she stepped back into Bellwether House, agreed to spend a night under its ceilings, she had crossed an invisible line. The presence gestured toward the cabinet once more. Some, it said, voice steady, almost affectionate, find eternity comforting. Fixed in porcelain, preserved against decay, valued as part of a collection that endures. And the other option, she asked, her throat tight. To leave, step through that door, return to Edinburgh. But know this, your city will be the same, your office untouched, your apartment unchanged. Yet you will not inhabit it fully. Something essential remains here. You are already fractured, present in two spaces at once. She pictured her life. The neat flat, the university office, the years of careful practice, of deliberate professional precision. All of it suddenly felt fragile, ghost-like. Walking through her old routines would no longer feel complete. A part of her would still be in this house, suspended between shelves and objects, a trace in porcelain and wood. What if I refuse both? She asked. Neither join the collection nor leave. The figure paused. Then it began to fade, not vanish, but thin, less substantial, like smoke curling around the corners of the room. Its outline shimmered, but its voice remained, distant yet insistent. Standing requires energy. Even resolve is finite. Eventually you tire. Eventually you choose. The collection waits, patient, eternal. And when it disappeared completely, she was alone. The room breathed quietly around her, the settled wood, the echoing ceiling, the faint scent of varnish and time. Every object, every book, every piece of furniture seemed suddenly alive, loaded with a gravity she hadn't felt before. They were no longer just objects. They were vessels, anchors, invitations. Her eyes returned to the cabinet. She approached slowly, heart hammering, every step deliberate. She studied the 8 porcelain figures on the third shelf with a focus sharper than ever before. Each one seemed more than a mere likeness. Hints of life flickered in their miniature faces. One bore the elegance of an Edwardian woman, another the upright poise of a Regency gentleman. Even the less defined figures seemed infused with intention, as if the artist had reached into the past and captured a soul rather than a shape. She lifted her phone and photographed the shelf again, her hands trembling slightly. The image loaded. 9 figures stood on the shelf. The 9th, the miniature of herself, stood at the far right, poised as if it had just arrived, just stepped into this carefully curated world. It faced the room, facing her, silent and immovable, yet brimming with presence. And in that instant she understood. The house hadn't claimed her yet, but it had already begun. The 9th figure hadn't vanished. It had never been where she thought. It was merely introducing itself to the existing collection, slipping into the established order unnoticed. Only 8 figures remained tangible on the third shelf, their porcelain faces serene, immovable. Dr. Kelway sank into the chair she had claimed months before, her mind racing with the rigor that had carried her through decades of investigations. Something had left Bellwether House with her 3 months ago, but it had not been entirely her. A shadow, a simulacrum, perfect in outward detail but hollow at its core, had walked back to Edinburgh. The question now was stark. Could she reclaim what had been left behind? Had the photographs captured what she had lost, or what she was becoming? Was the choice the uncle had hinted at real, or merely another layer of the collection's inscrutable design, a phantom of free will masking inevitable transformation? She rose, legs stiff, and approached the cabinet. The glass door was unlocked, confidence etched in every stroke of the uncle's life. He had not bothered to secure what he assumed was already his. Her fingers hovered over the empty spot where her miniature self should have been. Nothing. Air and porcelain, cold and indifferent. The figure existed for the lens, not for touch. A voice whispered from the doorway, soft but impossible to ignore. Not the uncle, but a woman. You're searching in the wrong place. Dr. Kelway turned. A woman stood framed in the doorway, garments evoking the 1920s, posture rigid yet graceful, a lifetime of discipline in every measured stance. In her hands rested a small leather case, the kind that held treasures both mundane and priceless. The collection, the woman said, doesn't trap us in objects, it traps us between them. She crossed the room deliberate, her eyes glinting with understanding that transcended time. In the air that separates one piece from another, in the spaces within cabinets, in the gaps between books, not the things themselves, but the relationships, the architecture of attention, the careful orchestration that makes a collection cohere, that is what contains us. Dr. Kelway's chest tightened as the weight of the revelation settled over her. She had been looking at the wrong layer of reality all along. The miniature on the shelf, the photograph, the careful documentation, they were markers, not prisons. The true space of the collection existed in the invisible threads woven between objects, in the currents of care and observation, in the subtle choreography of presence. Every breath she took felt magnified, as if the house itself had paused to watch her reckon with this truth. And in that quiet, suspended between porcelain and shadow, she understood that Bellwether House did not need ghosts to terrify. It needed her to see. Her movement carried the same unsettling glide Dr. Kelway had seen in the uncle, neither walking nor floating, but occupying the narrow, unnatural space between. A presence sustained by intention rather than muscle or bone. He's offered you a place, the woman said gently. You deserve to understand what acceptance actually means before you answer. She paused, then continued, voice steady with long-earned restraint. I was the first, or close to it, a nurse. I cared for him during an illness in the early 1950s. Her eyes flicked toward the cabinet. I made the mistake of noticing the collection, of asking questions, of admiring the care he took with provenance, with order. He liked that. Attention always pleased him. The leather case opened with a soft snap. Inside lay a series of small, aged labels, handwritten in precise script, dates, locations, donors, the earliest documentation of the collection's growth. When he recovered, he asked me to stay, she said. In a different role, curator, he called it, guardian of the collection's integrity. A humorless smile touched her mouth. I accepted because the work felt meaningful, because he framed it as collaboration, not ownership. She closed the case slowly. I didn't notice the change until it was finished, until I tried to leave and realized leaving required abandoning something essential. He collected me the way he collected everything else, through attention, through valuation. By making me part of a system I could not remove myself from without unmaking what I had become. Dr. Kelway asked the question that demanded asking. Why warn her if the collection existed to acquire? The woman's smile carried decades of bitterness. Because the collection requires informed consent, not legal consent, something deeper. You must choose to stay knowing exactly what staying is. Otherwise, the integration fails. Her gaze drifted to the cabinet's third shelf. And you remain as you are now, like the ninth figure in your photographs, present but untouchable, recorded but insubstantial, a modern ghost surface without substance. She returned the labels to the case and looked directly at Dr. Kelway, her eyes clear, unwavering. He will offer you eternity, preservation, a place where you are carefully maintained and forever valued. A pause. These are not lies. The collection is meticulous. You would be preserved as surely as porcelain. Then quietly, but preservation is not life. An eternity in porcelain is still imprisonment, no matter how beautiful the cell. She began to fade, not abruptly, but patiently, transparency spreading through her form as if time itself were reclaiming her. Her voice lingered after her body thinned to air. The choice is real, Dr. Kelway. The consequences are simply misunderstood. A final whisper carried through the space between objects. Leaving is also a form of acceptance, perhaps the most complete one of all. The room was silent, but it hummed with presence. Every object seemed to vibrate with a story, a memory folded into its form. Books were no longer mere paper and ink. They held the echoes of hands that had turned their pages, minds that had absorbed their contents, lives quietly entombed within covers. Chairs, tables, the sideboard, all containers of intention of those who had touched, rested, or lingered upon them. The house itself felt alive, a lattice of relationships and residuum, every piece connected through the invisible logic of the collection. Dr. Kelway moved toward the window. Outside, the grounds lay swathed in darkness, the first hints of dawn still 2 hours away. Somewhere, Mr. Marchmont would be waiting, punctual as ever, anticipating a report he may already know in full. The journals, the meticulous records, the inherited attentiveness, all ensured he understood far more than she did. She had a choice: recount the events to him, surrendering what she had seen to words, walk away into Edinburgh, leaving Bellwether House behind and wondering if the Dr. Kelway who had investigated, taught, and reasoned for the past 3 months had ever truly existed, or if she herself was already a part of the house's designs. Or accept the uncle's offer, joining the collection fully, aware and contained, preserved yet transformed, a participant in a system whose rules were older and more exacting than any law of physics or ethics. Her gaze swept the drawing room one last time. The cabinet's door still stood open, 8 porcelain figures frozen in their eternal postures, a gallery of human and historical specificity. The shelves of books maintained that obsessive order that whispered of deliberate care, not neglect. Every object, every curve of wood, every slight imperfection in porcelain seemed to pulse with latent meaning, a silent message she was only beginning to grasp. Slowly she approached the cabinet and closed the glass door. The latch clicked, a sound that felt like finality but also an acknowledgement. She collected her equipment with precision: camera, laptop, instruments that had measured, recorded, but never explained the phenomena. Each piece returned to its place in the bag with deliberate care, a ritual of preparation for departure, or perhaps of leaving behind a fragment of herself. The drawing room empty, she moved through the entrance hall, stepping into the pre-dawn chill. Gravel crunched beneath her shoes with reassuring weight. Her car waited as she had left it, keys secure in her pocket, tank sufficient for the journey back to Edinburgh. The horizon began to lighten, the faint gray of a world stirring awake. She drove through empty roads, the villages asleep, the mist hovering low. Every turn of the wheel felt loaded with quiet reflection, as if the house and its contents had followed her into the car, embedding themselves in the edges of her perception. The world seemed unchanged, yet she sensed the subtle, unshakable alteration in herself, an awareness that part of her presence might forever reside elsewhere, catalogued, observed, and eternally interwoven with objects that would outlast her, and perhaps, in some incomprehensible way, define her. Bellwether House receded in the rearview mirror, dark and still, holding secrets she could never entirely reclaim. And somewhere between the glass, the porcelain, and the shadows, the collection waited, patient, exacting, infinite. Have you ever touched something familiar and felt, just for a heartbeat, that it didn't recognize you back? The drive was quiet, too quiet. The town slid past her windows still half asleep, the streetlights blinking off like tired eyes. She pulled into a roadside stop just as the sky began to pale, bought a cup of coffee out of habit, and let it cool untouched between her hands. From the driver's seat, everything checked out. Her fingers gripped the wheel. The mirror reflected a face she had known for decades. Heat seeped through the cardboard cup. The air smelled like fuel, damp asphalt, early morning motion. Reality, loud and ordinary, proof that she was still here. She finished the drive. Her car slid into its usual space outside her building. The stairs creaked in their familiar way. Her door opened to the same apartment she'd lived in for 15 years, unchanged, obedient, waiting. Books aligned on shelves, papers stacked where she'd left them, a cup drying by the sink. She walked room to room, touching surfaces, pressing her palm to walls, grounding herself in weight and resistance. She boiled water, drank tea, let steam fill the shower, and dressed in clean clothes. By every external measure, the night she'd fled that old house had already been absorbed into the past. The day unfolded perfectly. Colleagues greeted her with practiced warmth. Students filed in with anxieties and half-formed questions. She lectured with precision, confidence honed over decades. She explained methods, cautioned against bias, spoke about evidence and limits and rigor. She sounded like herself. She looked like herself. The role fit as it always had. And then evening arrived. Alone again, she reached for a book she'd handled more times than she could count. The cover met her hand, but something misfired. Not the weight, not the texture. The mistake was subtler. The moment between wanting and touching felt delayed, as if the signal had traveled farther than it should have, as if a fraction of herself hadn't arrived with the rest. She tried again, another object, same result. It was like touching the world through a thin barrier, like wearing gloves you couldn't see. Everything responded, doors opened, lights switched on, pages turned, but the intimacy was gone. The quiet certainty that the world and her body were perfectly aligned had slipped out of sync. She stood very still. That's when she understood the warning she tried not to hear. She hadn't escaped intact. What left that house months ago had been convincing, functional, detailed enough to pass every test, but something essential had stayed behind, caught, persuaded, archived in ways no instrument could record. What remained was a version of her that could move through life flawlessly while missing the depth that made movement meaningful. Days passed. The sensation didn't fade, it sharpened. Food tasted thinner. Conversations felt rehearsed, even when spontaneous. Joy arrived on time but never stayed long enough to settle. At night, she dreamed of shelves and spaces between objects, of air holding shape, of being observed with careful approval. She realized then that leaving had been a choice, but not an escape. The house hadn't needed to keep her body. It had kept her connection. And now she lived on this side of the world like a perfect copy, accurate, capable, hollowed just enough to notice. Somewhere in a place arranged with obsessive care, patience waited. And collections, she knew now, never rush. Have you ever felt like the world around you is right, and yet somehow wrong? In the weeks after leaving Bellwether House, Catherine Keelway discovered what that really meant. Her hands touched objects as always, but the contact felt filtered, like reality had become a projection, an imitation of itself. Chairs, books, even her own pen obeyed her movements perfectly, yet lacked the subtle resonance of true presence. Something essential, some fraction of her own existence, remained behind, captured or persuaded to stay where she could not follow. Life went on with merciless precision. Conversations with colleagues played out like rehearsed scenes she observed from the outside. Meals had flavor but no texture, arriving as information rather than sensation. Sleep followed its schedule, but dreams were now a secondary layer, like watching someone else dream instead of experiencing it herself. The world moved in correct patterns, yet she felt herself slipping through it, a perfect copy navigating an imperfect reflection. Professionally, nothing changed. She lectured, published, supervised. Every gesture, every word bore the same authority she had always commanded. To the outside eye, she was intact, competent, complete, methodical, precise. And yet, when the apartment went silent, when the lights dimmed and the city outside her window fell into the rhythm of night, she opened her laptop and returned to the photographs she had taken at Bellwether House. There it was again, the ninth figure, always there in the images, never in her direct memory. Its porcelain form had grown more defined with each viewing, its posture evolving, its gaze studying the room as though alive. It wasn't fear in that small face, nor resignation, it was curiosity, observational, analytical, a mirror of her own mind, yet confined to the shelf. 3 months later, a message arrived. Mr. Marchmont, calm, precise, clinical. His email spoke of cataloging the uncle's collections, of donations to museums, of one item that demanded her personal attention, a cabinet of curiosities containing porcelain figures of historic and now intimate significance. Attached, a photograph. The cabinet glowed under museum lighting, each object crisp and unmistakable. On the third shelf, 9 figures stood, and there it was, the newest at the center, modern clothing, a tiny camera in one hand, its head tilted slightly, capturing its own surroundings with the expression of someone who observes to understand, not to fear. Academic, methodical, alive in a way that defied touch, defied expectation. Catherine leaned closer, heart thudding. The figure wasn't just a likeness, it was an echo of her, a reflection of the part of herself left behind in Bellwether House. And for the first time she understood. Some things don't return home. They stay where they were meant to, lingering between the spaces we inhabit, visible only through the eyes we leave behind. Reality, she realized, could be documented, measured, even photographed. But presence could not be reclaimed once it had been rearranged, stored, and immortalized in porcelain. And she had been careful once, too careful. Now all that remained was evidence, and the creeping certainty that her reflection, her essence, was no longer entirely hers. Have you ever wondered what it really means to leave something behind? Catherine Keelway sat in her apartment, the city of Edinburgh unfolding below her like a map of her own life. Streetlights flickered on, buildings glowed with quiet energy, the familiar rhythm of a life meticulously built and meticulously lived. Every desk, every hallway, every student she would lecture tomorrow, it all existed exactly as she had left it. Everything tangible, everything verifiable, and yet she knew it wasn't whole. She closed her laptop slowly, the photograph of the cabinet from Bellwether House lingering behind her eyes. She had seen herself, not just reflected but captured, preserved in porcelain, positioned in a collection that waited for her, for the part of her that truly mattered. She had thought she'd refused, had walked away with autonomy intact, claiming freedom over permanence. But the collection didn't need her to stay inside the house. It only needed the core, the essence, the unreplicable thread of presence that made her herself. That fragment had remained behind. Everything else, the lectures, the papers, the seminars, the professional life, carried on as if complete, as if nothing had changed. To anyone watching, Catherine was exactly who she had always been. Competent, present, whole, yet she knew better. Some part of her vital, irreplaceable, had been quietly curated, cataloged, and stored on a shelf 300 miles away, perfectly preserved, perfectly documented, and she had been allowed to continue, unaware of the true cost. The collection was patient, methodical, invisible in its strategy. The genius of it wasn't in trapping her, it was in letting her believe she had escaped, while ensuring the part that mattered remained under its care. Weeks later, the announcement came. Mr. Marchmont opened Bellwether House to the public. The press celebrated it as a cultural treasure, a private collection spanning centuries, curated with museum-level precision. Visitors were encouraged, yet limited, to ensure the space remained pristine. Thursday through Sunday, 11 to 4 with modest admission. The house had been renovated, made safe for those who came to admire beauty, history, and craftsmanship. And somewhere inside, behind glass and polished wood, on a shelf that would never be empty, the ninth figure waited, watching, present, patient, her essence preserved in silence, reminding her that sometimes the part of you that truly matters can be taken without ever being seen. And the world outside, the streets, the lights, the life she touched every day kept spinning, unaware that the real Catherine Keelway was no longer entirely there. She had chosen freedom, yes, but freedom had its price, and some things, she realized, are impossible to reclaim once they've been collected. Have you ever wondered what it truly means to return, only to find that nothing is quite as it seems? Catherine Keelway felt it immediately the moment she stepped back onto the winding roads that led to Bellwether House. The trees leaned the same way, the gravel crunched under her tires in the same rhythm, and the house itself emerged from the mist with its familiar, impossibly skewed proportions. Everything felt wrong, yet eerily familiar, as if the landscape remembered her steps even before she took them. Mr. Marchmont met her at the entrance, a brass nameplate gleaming on his chest, curator. He looked thinner now, frailer, the relentless precision of his movements etched into the taut lines of his face. His eyes, though, were the same, measuring, cataloging, as though he were scanning her like one of the objects in his care. He did not blink. He did not flinch. He welcomed her with the practiced courtesy of someone who had long ago mastered the art of masking obsession as charm. "The drawing room's cabinet of curiosities might interest you," he said, his voice calm, almost rehearsed. Inside, the house hummed with the low murmur of visitors moving carefully from room to room. Couples lingered over Georgian sideboards. Elders photographed rare volumes. Sketchbooks fluttered in the hands of careful students. Everyone approached the artifacts as though they were sacred, untouchable, preserved under glass and years of reverence. Catherine followed the subtle pull toward the drawing room, where a small crowd had gathered around the cabinet she knew too well. The third shelf, she realized, held the 9 figures she had seen in photographs over the last months. 8 were traditional, porcelain echoes of history, but the ninth was her own. Standing confidently, modern, holding a small camera, its eyes cast in the same inquisitive way hers always were when documenting phenomena. A teenager snapped a photo, shared it with a friend, and they moved on without a second thought. But Catherine lingered, staring at the shelf. In reality, in the physical world, 9 figures stood together. In photographs, 9 figures appeared exactly the same. Presence and documentation had merged. The division between what had walked with her through Edinburgh and what had remained on that shelf had dissolved. The integration was complete. She understood now. The collection did not merely preserve, it unified. It did not just hold objects. It absorbed lives, attention, the very essence of those who engaged with it. And somewhere in that delicate balance, Catherine realized she had returned, but she was not alone. She stepped back, feeling the subtle weight of history, presence, and absence all at once. The house had waited, and now it was whole. The rest of the house moved around her like a carefully rehearsed play. Every room she had once documented now gleamed with purpose. Objects she had touched, measured, photographed. Everything had been reorganized, labeled, contextualized. Bellwether House had transformed from a private labyrinth of obsession into a public stage, each artifact poised to tell its story to anyone who would listen. Mr. Marchmont had completed the metamorphosis. Personal fixation converted into institutional authority, obsession codified into culture. She found him in the North Wing study, seated behind the massive desk that had once belonged to his uncle. A laptop glowed before him, its screen alive with rows upon rows of cataloged objects, locations, estimated value, provenance, risk assessments. His fingers moved across the keys with relentless precision, as if each stroke were a silent prayer. Concentration etched into his face like a permanent mask, the same intensity she had glimpsed months ago. He was consumed, yet purposeful, as though the collection had claimed him entirely, and he had surrendered willingly. Catherine hesitated at the doorway, watching without disturbing. Some things, she realized, are meant to be witnessed, not interacted with. When she finally approached, he offered her the pen with the meticulous courtesy of someone performing a ritual. She signed, dated, left the comment section blank. He nodded, thanked her, and reminded her that membership was available to support the ongoing preservation of the collection. She promised to consider it, though she understood, deep down, that consideration was already part of the system he had perfected. Outside, the sun struck the windows, reflecting the world without revealing the secrets inside. Visitors moved in and out, carrying cameras, notebooks, photographs, and fleeting impressions of what they had seen, evidence that could be recorded, yet never fully understood. She paused at the gravel drive, taking one last look at the house that had quietly rewritten her sense of reality. The journey back to Edinburgh was surreal, familiar, yet distant. The countryside rolled past, each tree, each curve of the road observed rather than experienced, as if she were a ghost riding alongside herself. At her flat, she unpacked methodically, brewed tea, and prepared for the next day, every motion precise, deliberate, unshakable. And somewhere in a cabinet 300 miles away, a ninth figure stood watching, waiting, fully present and fully her. Have you ever touched something and felt almost nothing? As if the thing was there, but the reality of it had slipped just out of reach. That's the sensation Catherine Kelway woke to each evening, standing before her mirror, searching for the self she thought she knew. Her reflection stared back, familiar, unchanged, flawless, but memory had begun to wobble. Had she always felt this subtle distance from herself? Was she performing life rather than living it? She lowered her hand, the chill of uncertainty lingering, and returned to her desk. Papers needed grading, research reports demanded attention, students waited with questions she alone could answer. Work was constant, a lifeline of structure, a reassurance that some portion of reality remained intact, even if the core of her own presence had quietly slipped somewhere else. The duties she executed anchored her to the world she recognized. She moved, typed, instructed, corrected, actions precise, deliberate, mechanical at first glance, but underlined with an unspoken tension only she could feel. 300 miles away, in a house hidden among misted woods, a small cabinet rested in a quiet room. Within it, porcelain figures kept their frozen vigil. One, a woman dressed in contemporary clothing, cradled a miniature camera in her hands. Visitors passed by daily, snapping photos and studying her stillness, unaware of the subtle shift that occurred when the lens captured her image. Alone in the frame, she seemed to breathe, posture tilted just slightly, eyes intent, like she was documenting the space just beyond their sight. Stand in the room yourself and she was inert. Capture her with a photograph, and she became alive in a way reality alone could not render. Presence, it seemed, existed only when mediated, recorded, verified. The house, now open to the public, had shed its secrets and become something else. Not a private obsession, not a haunted curiosity, a living museum where every visitor unwittingly participated in the collection's quiet, meticulous ritual. Every photograph, every whispered remark, every lingering glance reinforced its purpose. The influence of the house no longer depended on fear. It relied on documentation, on the act of observing and sharing. Its life extended far beyond the walls themselves, carried outward into the world through memory and evidence. And in Edinburgh, Catherine Kelway carried on. Lectures delivered, papers reviewed, experiments conducted. She advised students, responded to colleagues, maintained the rhythm of a life that appeared normal, consistent, intact. She existed in all the ways one could measure existence: movement, action, accountability. But beneath the surface, she sensed the subtle hollow where something essential had been left behind. A part of her core had stayed behind, contained in porcelain and arrangement, preserved by attention and careful placement. She poured herself a cup of tea, feeling its warmth, smelling the faint bitterness of leaves steeping in water, tasting reality filtered through ritual. Everything seemed ordinary, everything seemed safe, and yet the thought lingered. She was both present and absent, whole in action yet incomplete in essence. The collection had won in silence, not by force but by patience, by precision, by the quiet assurance that what mattered most could remain while the rest carried on as if untouched. Outside her window, Edinburgh twinkled with a calm disregard for the invisible rules that governed Bellwether House. Streets stretched below, buildings stood firm, and life moved forward. She had chosen freedom, or so she believed. Yet freedom, she realized, had its own form of captivity. Some part of herself now existed elsewhere, cataloged, preserved, framed within a sequence of photographs, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to understand what it meant to be fully present, fully observed, fully part of something larger than any single life could contain. And so Catherine Kelway moved through her days, performing her role, executing her duties, inhabiting her life. Professional, competent, authoritative. But behind each measured action, behind each deliberate choice, there was a quiet echo, a reminder that presence is fragile, that reality can be shared, split, and documented, and that some things once claimed are never fully reclaimed. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to exist, and yet not fully be? To move through the world as yourself, while part of you quietly lingers somewhere else, silent, frozen, observed, but untouchable. That was the shadow Catherine Kelway carried through her days. By morning, she was precise, exact, performing her duties as lecturer, researcher, mentor. Every movement verified, every action observed, every detail documented. To the outside world, she was whole, present, real. But late at night, when the city's lights softened and her apartment sank into quiet, she could feel it. A subtle hollow beneath the familiar weight of her body, a gap where authenticity should have lived. Was this her moving, thinking, teaching? Or was it only a perfect imitation, shaped enough to fool colleagues, solid enough to navigate her apartment, but missing something vital, something no mirror could reflect? The question had no answer, and perhaps that was the collection's cruelest trick. It wasn't transformation that held the deepest power. It was doubt. The unsettling awareness that self might not be a thing at all, but a series of actions, a record of behaviors meticulously observed, cataloged, repeated. That the line between being and seeming might exist only in documentation, in evidence, in photographs that never lie and never tell the whole truth. She closed her laptop, set the cup of tea aside, and lay down. Tomorrow would demand the same rituals: students, lectures, papers, meetings. Work would proceed, and she would proceed along with it. Whether the continuing of her life was real or a perfect replica, whether it held substance or was merely surface, mattered less than the act itself. The collection had already taught her something profound. The questions sometimes answer themselves simply by being asked. Uncertainty, it seemed, could be the only certainty left. The moment you believe you've escaped is often the moment you've already been claimed. Beyond her window, Edinburgh breathed in quiet patterns of lamps and traffic, unaware of the invisible exchange. And somewhere 300 miles away, Bellwether House sat wrapped in its own solemnity, its objects arranged, labeled, preserved. Visitors came and went, snapping photos, jotting notes, feeling they understood. But in truth, every observer became part of the collection itself. The newest figure, her miniature self, camera in hand, poised for observation, remained perfectly still on its shelf, waiting patiently, waiting for someone else to look, to record, to verify. The collection expanded slowly, inevitably. Its genius lay in subtlety. The finest possessions are those who never realize they've been possessed at all. Morning would come. Catherine Kelway would rise, dress, and step into her professional life with practiced grace. Every lecture delivered, every student advised, every paper reviewed would extend the collection's reach further into the world, spreading its influence quietly, invisibly, through her documented presence. She would be the surface, the form, the interface between reality and something that no one could ever touch. And beneath it all, the essential self, the substance of presence, remained elsewhere, preserved, catalogued, forever part of something larger than her conscious understanding.